All right, we are looking like we're live now. And so um, I'm going to share my screen with you guys here in a second to kind of show you something that I wanted to talk about. But there was an article that came out really recently on the 14th, and it was specifically talking about 1 in 3 sellers that are granting buyer concessions. And for those of you that don't know what a concession is, it's essentially viewed as a credit, also called a concession, right? So it's when you are buying property and you either ask for closing costs or you ask for money towards a repair or whatever it may be. That's considered a credit and a concession. They're kind of interchangeable as far as the word is used around. But seeing that 1 in 3 sellers are granting this now is something that we've obviously been noticing in our market because of things that are happening from a bigger picture. So primarily, we're talking about interest rates here. So anytime you have large interest rates and demand kind of drops a little bit, you're going to see more creative measures in the negotiation world within real estate that you wouldn't see in markets like what we saw during the pandemic, where buyers had almost no leverage. Right, you were seeing buyers waive inspections and pay over asking price and multiple offers, and that's kind of the inverse of what we're seeing now. So I'm going to switch my screen now and show you the article that I'm referencing. And so this is the one that came out on November 14th, and this is for Florida realtors. So unless you're a Florida realtor, you're probably not looking at this, but this is just good intel and information for Florida agents to understand what's happening. And then also, if you're a buyer or seller in Florida, these are things that you can read up on. But so I started reading this, and it got me really, really curious about what my market's doing. And I do have some spreadsheets and things that I've done for my local market, which is the Space Coast, otherwise known as Brevard County. And a lot of the numbers that I ran are very similar to what this article is talking about, but it's saying 1 in 3 sellers are granting buyer concessions. It goes on to kind of talk about what those concessions are used for, help reduce the buyer's total cost of purchasing the home. It could be money towards repairs, closing costs, mortgage rate buy downs. I'll talk about that a little bit. And it does not include a seller lowered list price or price cut. So this could be where you bring in a credit in lieu of a price reduction, and a lot of times you see that. So a buyer can finance some of the closing costs or whatever it may be. But I thought this was really interesting. It's basically saying 33 percent and some change in some of the markets. So Miami was 35.4%, Orlando 34.3%, and then Tampa. And it did not cover the Space Coast. So I went ahead and covered the Space Coast. So I'm going to switch over here now. I have a series of 2 spreadsheets that I made. This is where I get really a little nerdy when it comes to real estate. So within the MLS, there's tons, tons of data that I can extrapolate here to kind of get a better gauge of what's happening within the market. So what I did is essentially I looked at sales from January to May, and I split them from January to May, and then I did June to November. I looked at price point between 350,000 and 550,000, which is going to be medium price point, and it's going to be the largest data set that we can grab from that. And then I limited it to single family homes only. And, for the first half of the year, we'll call it, we saw 1,471 closed transactions within the MLS. So that was the first data set that I'm using here. And after looking at all of the sales and kind of putting things together, it turns out that out of all of those sales, the 1,471, 445 of them annotated within the MLS that the seller paid some sort of concession, which does represent a pretty good amount. It's 30% of all of the sales the sellers conceded or offered some sort of concession or credit for that sale. I then took it a step further to kind of get an idea as to how much we're looking at. So on average, we're looking at $6,500 is how much that seller contributed towards the buyer's closing costs, repairs, rate buy down, whatever it may be. Additionally, I'm also able to read comments as to what these are for. And I'll kind of move this over so it's a little bit closer so you guys can see this. But this is the column here where the agent that has the listing, before they close it out, if they mark yes, as far as the seller offered concessions, and then they annotate how much, then there's an option where they can annotate remarks as to maybe why the seller contributed. So a lot of these are going to seller credit, closing costs, buyer closing costs. You're going to see that more than anything else, but there are definitely going to be some in here. When you ever see that larger figure, 10,000, for this price point, that's a pretty hefty amount there. You see another one over here, 6,400, 20,000 for repairs. Holy shit, that's a lot of repairs, right? 17,000 for furniture, that probably should not go in there, because if that was a cash deal, that doesn't make any sense. Ridiculous. Some of these agents, if it's a cash deal, why are you going to offer closing costs? Right? You just lower the price. You don't do a credit on a cash deal, because now that buyer has to pay taxes on that higher. I'm sorry, if you're a cash buyer, you should probably not be getting a cash credit or a credit. Just reduce the price. That's the first kind of thing there. But you're seeing a lot of these larger numbers, and typically what you're going to see, if it's a larger number in this price category, anywhere between 15,000 to 20,000, it should be going towards what's called a rate buy down, which is where the seller pays for the buyer's rate to be bought down. It could be a 2-1 buy down or a 3-2-1 buy down. The last time I went live, we talked all about what that entails, but it's essentially where the seller pays for the first 2 or 3 years of your loan to be a lower interest rate. If you don't know what that is, just go ahead and look it up. It's a really good option that we're seeing in the market right now. So that was the first basically half of the year. Now transitioning over to the second half of the year. So first half, we saw 30%. Going into the second half, obviously we haven't closed out the year yet, so we're not going to have the full amount of data to kind of look at as far as where we're at with sales. But when looking at from June to November, total sales, we've seen 1,287, which is a little bit lighter than what we saw the first half of the year. And I think things will start to even out because we have another month and a half before we go out. But after looking at all of that, I looked at all the transactions that where the sellers offered concessions or credits, and represented 334 of those, which represents 26%. So a little bit less than the first half of the year. And then when looking at the average, basically 6,300, if you can see that right here. So just a little bit lighter than what we saw the first half of the year. So not a huge swing in more sellers offering closing costs the second half of the year, which when I was first doing this research, I was like thinking absolutely, this is going to be the half where the sellers are going to be offering a lot more incentives, way more concessions, and a larger amount to offset the higher interest rates. But in fact, that's wrong. That's not what we saw. So looking at here too, as to what these sellers offered credits for, this is where I saw the bigger amounts. So you have one here, 15,000, where the seller offered concessions towards a rate buy down. Another 15 seller credit towards buyer closing costs and prepaids. And a lot of these too, you might max out depending on the purchase price and your loan type. You can max out at a certain amount of closing costs, so you need to be careful on that. I've seen buyers on contracts ask for way more than they can get, and that's just because their agent didn't do the due diligence with the lender to figure out what that maximum amount is. Seller concessions for rate buy down, another one here. That's a 20K, right? That's a huge amount right there, and that was on a price point of 450. Closing costs, 2% of closing costs, all these other things here. But overall, we saw 26% so far this second half of the year, and then 30% the first half of the year. And so, switch this back over. What that means is the article that we talked about early on, and I'll go back to that so you guys can see it. This article here is actually pretty accurate for our marketplace as well. You see these markets here where it's a little bit grander, like Tampa is just a bigger metro. So 43% of the sellers that are offering concessions. That tells me that these are sellers the demand there is probably far less than some other markets. So sellers have to get really creative as far as ways to entice buyers. But if you're a buyer in this market, understanding how closing costs can be used and leveraged, I think is a really important tool that you should be using and or asking your agent about. I know every buyer that I work with, that's kind of one of the first things I want to understand about their buying process is if they want to try and fight for closing costs, whether those costs are going to be helping buy down some of their closing costs that they need to use, whether they want to attack for a rate buy down, or they want to use those closing costs for another thing. It could just be, hey, we'll say it's for repairs, whatever it may be. We're seeing a lot of that in the market. So just think about that when you're looking at homes and you're seeing a property that's been on the market for a bit, right? So like 30 days or grander, and then look at the price history on it. Have they made a lot of price adjustments? Have they not? You can read into all of that stuff and get a good read as to like what's the motivation of this seller, and then start kind of getting a game plan together. So let's say you're looking at a $450,000 home. It's been on the market for 30 days. They've reduced a couple of times. They started at 500 and they've made their way down. Like that to me tells me it's a seller that's motivated. So they're bringing the price down. They were unrealistic on their first approach, so they've brought it down. 450 now is probably where they should have started, so they have some lost time. And 30 days on the market, in this market, it's not completely like a dead listing, but it's sat there. And you can kind of start looking into it and get a better understanding of like, is this an opportunity for us as buyers? So you could go in and say, hey, we'll offer you 450 and we want 20K in closing costs or 20K for a rate buy down or whatever it may be. Like, these are the options that buyers have in this market. But more of this idea was to just kind of show you guys this article and then also let you know in our marketplace what we're seeing. You know, on average, it's about 30%. So this article is accurate. It's pretty much right where we are at. And for buyers out there, that's a really good sign for you guys. It gives you a little bit of leverage. And sellers, something for you to understand too. You're more than likely, the odds are in the favor pretty much of the buyer to ask for some sort of concession. So that's the whole reason I wanted to go live here and share this with you guys. Hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, always go ahead, drop it in the comments. I'll get back to you on that stuff. But I just thought this was really interesting. I wanted to share. That's all.